On this episode of Death Row Stories, 6 members of a Texas family are brutally murdered.
There was a devil stabbing them repeatedly.
And a suspect is sent to death row. But when a journalism professor starts to investigate,
Anthony had been convicted on nothing.
and an accomplice changes his story,
He chose in his dying breath to try to right a wrong.
the state vows to keep its conviction.
He was guilty. There's no doubt in my mind.
Shut up and take your punishment.
There's a body in the water.
He was butchered and murdered.
Many people proclaim their innocence.
In this case, there are a number of things that stink.
This man is remorseless.
He needs to pay for it with his life.
The electric chair flashed in front of my eyes.
Get a conviction at all costs. Let the truth fall where it may.
I grew up in Somerville, Texas. It's a very small town. We have one stoplight there. My mother and my grandmother practically lived across the street from one another. I had 2 daughters, and during the summer of '92, they were in Houston with me. One day, I took the girls to my mother's house in Somerville. And I dropped them off, and then I came back to Houston. About 3 o'clock that morning, my aunt called. She said, "Keith, the girls, are they with you?" I said, "No, they with Mama." She said, "Your mama's house caught on fire." And so I jumped up. We get to the street where you turn to go to my mother's house, and we could see all the people out there, the fire trucks, the ambulances, and all of that. And we just all broke down and we started crying.
Somerville firefighters would eventually extinguish the blaze. But inside, they discovered 6 of Keith's family members brutally murdered. Keith's mother, Bobby, was found in the living room with 23 stab wounds. His sister was found stabbed, bludgeoned, and shot in the head. Finally, Keith's niece, nephew, and his 2 young daughters had all been stabbed multiple times.
Brittany was my firstborn. My little one, the one we call Shug, one of her stab wounds went through her heart. There was a devil that was stabbing them repeatedly, and I couldn't be there for them.
Veteran Burleson County District Attorney Charles Sebesta immediately assumed supervision of the case.
When I arrived on the scene, I was told that there were 6 people dead. The fact that there were 3 weapons used was a fairly good reasoning for believing that there were multiple people that were involved in those murders. There were a lot of things that, over the years that I had to deal with, some of them were very unpleasant. But this was horrendous. 6 people killed and 4 of them were children. When you think about all of that, I mean, it's difficult to sleep at night.
Four days after the murders, a funeral was held for the 6 victims. Prison guard Robert Carter, whose 4-year-old son Jason had been killed, showed up with his wife, Cookie.
Robert Carter walks up to me. He was bandaged on his ear and on his hands. And he says, "Keith, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, Keith." And I told him, "Man, I'm sorry for you as well, because I know how much you love Jason."
Carter had recently faced a paternity suit brought by Jason's mother for child support.
My uncle said, "Keith, who was that?" And I said, "Oh, that's Jason's dad. That's Robert." He said, "Keith, that's who killed your mama."
That afternoon, Carter was brought in for questioning by the Texas Rangers. Carter claimed he had burned himself lighting a fire on his lawn and said he had nothing to do with the murders. But when given a polygraph, Carter failed. He then pointed to his wife's cousin, Anthony Graves, as his accomplice. 26-year-old Anthony Graves was an unemployed warehouse worker on probation for drug dealing. police arrested Graves and brought him to the station.
You're charged with the offense of capital murder.
Who?
An affidavit charging you for this offense.
Capital murder? Me? Man, this is a big mistake.
Graves told police he was at home with his girlfriend at the time of the murders. But like Carter, Graves also failed a polygraph.
Lie detector tests are not admissible in court, but they're a very effective tool. I had a policy as district attorney. If you took and passed a polygraph, I would not prosecute. Anthony Graves failed it miserably.
Both Anthony Graves and Robert Carter would face the death penalty.
We needed someone to answer for what they had done to our family. And Charles Sylvester could make it happen.
Robert Carter's trial began in January 1994. Sebesta showed the jury photos of Carter's burns and forensic evidence that tied Carter to bullets found at the crime scene.
During the first trial, all I did was look at Robert Carter the whole time. But he wouldn't look back at me. He would glance at me and then he would look away.
He was convicted and was sentenced to death.
Anthony Graves' trial began 8 months later. Sebesta's star witness was Robert Carter.
Carter said that Bobby Davis, the 46-year-old grandmother that was killed, worked at the state school with Anthony Graves' mother, and a promotion was given to Bobby instead of her.
Carter said Anthony Graves had confronted Bobby about the promotion and stabbed her to death. Then, after killing the children, Anthony set the house on fire. For the murder weapon, Sebesta presented a knife that matched one that Graves owned.
In the stab wounds in the skull caps of some of the children, the knife fit like a hand in a glove.
During the trial, I looked at Anthony, but unlike Robert, when I looked at him, he looked back at me. But I wouldn't back down. I was like, I want you dead.
Sebesta also presented 4 witnesses who had overheard Graves and Carter discussing the murders while in lockup.
The sheriff had put Graves across the hall from Carter in the dispatch office to listen to any conversation. Conversations like, I did it for you, keep your mouth shut.
Finally, jurors were confronted with graphic photos of the murder victims.
When pictures of small children and death are shown to a jury in a capital case, generally it's going to take the defense some effort in overcoming that image. Those pictures were shown to the jury frequently.
The jury spent a lot of time in considering all of the evidence. They found him guilty, and they sentenced him to death.
He started to cry. It was like, what are you crying for? You know what you did, you deserve this, and so shut up and take your punishment.
When I became DA, I never thought I'd ever have to try a capital murder case. But when you're elected to do a job, you have the responsibility to do that job, and that goes with the territory.
Both of my attorneys were inexperienced, overwhelmed, outplayed, outmanned. And they was dealing with a prosecutor who would do anything to win. I'm innocent.
After facing trial for the murder of the Davis family in late 1994, Anthony Graves was sentenced to death.
I get to death row, and we're walking down this big old hallway in shackles and handcuffs, all the way to the end. I laid in the bunk, I put the covers over my head, and for the whole week, that's how I laid. Visualize my life in the free world, minute by minute by minute. Because I didn't belong there. And finally, I decided that I was not gonna just lay down and give them my life for something I did not do. You're gonna have to fight me for it.
While Graves' attorneys worked on his appeals, Texas journalism professor Nicole Cazares assigned the case to her Innocence investigation class.
We all approached the case with the assumption that Anthony Graves was guilty and that We had a heavy, heavy burden before we would ever be able to conclude that he was wrongly convicted. I went to death row with one of my students and met Anthony for the first time.
Nicole Caceres came to see me. When I met her, the first thing I wanted to say, I'm not finna sit here and try to convince you that I'm innocent. If you do the work, you'll find out. And she left, and she went back home.
I didn't feel that I have any special intuitive powers to look in someone's eyes and tell whether or not they're telling me the truth. I wanted to base my decision on the evidence.
Caceres began by researching Anthony's background to better understand who Anthony was before he landed on death row.
Anthony was my first and only son. I knew who my son was. I know what he was about, you know. He was not a murderer.
Growing up, my mom, she was always working, so Anthony was the one taking care of us. He always was at the baseball field, and we was right behind him.
Anthony had been a talented baseball prospect before his life took a major turn with the birth of his first child.
Anthony dropped out of high school to get a job and take care of his son. And he was a good dad, even though he was a young dad, but he was a good dad.
Local businessman Roy Reuter took Anthony under his wing, giving him a job and a spot on the company's softball team.
Anthony played third base for us. We became pretty close. He was an usher in my wedding. And so you can only imagine that in August of 1992, a news flash comes on about the murder, that they had made an arrest. And I was like, that's impossible. There's no way.
Reuter was approached by the prosecution at a preliminary hearing 3 months before Anthony's trial. Sebesta was looking for a murder weapon.
The assistant district attorney came up behind me, started asking me questions, and he said, did Anthony carry a knife? I said, no, he never carried a knife. I said, the only knife that I can recall that Anthony ever had was one that I gave him. And it was a flimsy piece of garbage. It was a switchblade knife that I bought in a kit. I had 2 of them identical. And he goes, well, do you have the other identical knife that you speak of? And I said, yes, I do. And they said, we're just gonna run some tests on it and, you know, we'll give it back.
Sebesta turned it around so that all of a sudden this knife was now the knife that Graves used to kill the children.
These people are telling me, well, in the skull caps of one of the child victims, that this knife fit like a glove, and they just kept hammering me. And I just got confused. Okay, yeah, all right, I'll testify.
After Reuter testified he'd given Anthony a knife, Sebesta called Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Roberto Bayardo, who concluded that Anthony's knife was consistent with the victim's wounds.
I cross-examined Dr. Bayardo, and we'd gotten kitchen knives, we'd gotten dinner knives, and he said that he was not able to specifically determine what type of knife it was. Our expert was very adamant that it could not have been that type of knife that was shown.
In order to have inflicted the multiple stab wounds on these victims, the knife would have had a certain amount of strength to it, and this knife never would have made it because the knife was such a piece of junk.
And I was just being used, but I was pretty naive about how things worked.
Considering Sebesta's handling of Roy Reuter, Caceres next looked into the jailhouse workers who testified that they'd heard Graves and Carter openly discussing the murders.
Under Texas law, Carter's testimony can't be the only thing used to convict. They have to have corroboration, and this is the corroboration that the state came up with. These 4 jailhouse snitches who were just completely unreliable.
Caceres found detailed logs kept by the prison guards, but not a single entry about Graves and Carter discussing the murders.
What inmates who had been in that jail told me was that the hall had a big metal draw fan that made a ton of noise. The guards supposedly had this intercom system where they could listen in on what was happening in the jail. But hearing Graves and Carter talking over the intercom across the hall would be pretty well impossible to do. There was too much noise. It was too loud. What I started to realize was that Anthony had been convicted on nothing, that there was no real evidence against him, and that was very disturbing. We have a man on death row, and I don't think he did it. I think he's innocent.
Journalism professor Nicole Cazares had come to believe that Anthony Graves was innocent, and she was surprised to learn that Anthony had an alibi. He'd been at home with his family and his girlfriend Yolanda Mathis at the time of the murders.
Yolanda and I was together at my mother's apartment. My sister, Dietrich, she was in the kitchen cooking fish sticks, and my brother, Arthur, was on the phone in the back room. We hung out to, I guess maybe 1:30, 2 o'clock that morning, and then everybody go to bed. So, a regular night.
My mom called me about 7:15 that morning, and she told me her best friend had got killed in Somerville. Her daughter, and her 4 grandkids. I got upset about it, and I wanted to go tell Anthony what happened. And he said whoever did that, need their ass whooped. And so he laid back down and went back to sleep. I knew where he was, and I knew he was at home with us.
At trial, Anthony's brother Arthur confirmed this alibi. But when Anthony's girlfriend Yolanda was called, Charles Sebesta made a surprise announcement.
We got to court in the middle of the trial, and we called her name. And all of a sudden, Sebesta stood up and he said, "Judge, I've got to let you know that she may be a co-defendant in this case."
She is a suspect in these murders, and it is quite possible at some point in the future she might be indicted.
I started crying, and I just didn't do it because I was scared.
When I saw her run out of the courtroom, I didn't know who Yolanda Mathis was at all. Sebesta told us that she refused to testify, so we thought she was lying.
She was terrified, and what she said to me was, "I knew that my boyfriend had been in jail now for 2 years. I knew that he was innocent. What was to prevent the district attorney from doing the same thing to me?"
In fact, Sebesta used a similar tactic against Robert Carter's wife, Cookie.
Back in '92, we were able to get indictments against Carter, against Graves, and against Carter's wife, Cookie.
By indicting Cookie, now Charles Sebesta has more leverage over Robert Carter, because Robert's worried about what happens to his wife.
That leverage would come into play the night before Anthony's trial, when Robert Carter told the DA's office he wouldn't testify against Anthony.
Robert breaks down and says, I don't want to testify against Anthony. At that point, Charles Sebesta makes a deal with him.
I finally said, "Robert, if you testify and we agree not to question you about Cookie and her involvement in those murders, would you do it?"
And Robert Carter takes that deal. He agrees to testify against Anthony.
You have to do what you have to do in these cases. You sort of attempt to hit the pitch that the pitcher throws. In this case, Carter was doing the pitching. I was concerned about the Graves trial because that's who we were trying, and that's what we needed the evidence for.
Having gotten what he needed from Carter, Sebesta subsequently dismissed all charges against Cookie. Despite Cazares being convinced of Anthony's innocence, Graves sat on death row awaiting execution.
No one understands how important human contact really is until it's taken from you. It can really, really eat at a man's soul. For long periods of time, I would go without seeing my family because they couldn't deal with seeing me behind bars. I was trying to save my sanity. and I needed a support system that was consistent.
Anthony said, "Are you willing to see this through, when the ending may not be what we want?" It's a hard thing if you've come to believe that the person on the other side of the plexiglass is innocent, then to be able to get in your car and drive away. And we never talked about it after that. It didn't need to be said. The fact that I came the next time meant that I was willing to go forward with it.
Tomorrow, Robert Earl Carter is scheduled to be the next man Texas will execute by lethal injection.
I know that there are some flaws in the death penalty, but I can't say that I'm not for it, because I wouldn't want Robert Carter to have any enjoyment in his life in prison. When they scheduled his execution, I just said, let him die. They set us right in front of a window. He's strapped to the table, and they asked him if there's anything that he wants to say. And he turned and looked at us, and when he did that, I just turned around. I didn't want to hear anything he had to say, and I wanted him to know that apology not accepted and no excuses.
But with his last words, Robert Carter would make a shocking final statement.
Robert Carter, he had his family there, he had the victim's family there. Out of anything he could have said, he chose in his dying declaration, his last breath, to try to right a wrong. He told the whole world, finally, I was innocent.
Anthony Graves had been on death row for 6 years when in the year 2000, Robert Carter admitted on the execution table that Graves was innocent.
People think Carter only said that when he was on the gurney. The truth is, he'd been trying to exonerate me for years.
Robert Carter wrote me a letter. He said that Anthony wasn't there and that he was there alone. He said that he and my mother got into a fight and he was beating her with a hammer, and all of a sudden the children started to wake up, and one thing led to another, and since everybody in the house knew him, he had to kill everybody. But every time we would ask Charles Sylvester about the statements that Robert Carter had said, he was like, no, Robert was lying.
You don't walk in carrying a hammer in one hand and a knife in your mouth and a gun in the other hand. It just didn't happen that way.
And so when he wrote that letter, I tore it up.
Defense attorney Roy Greenwood worked on Anthony's appeals and was also contacted by Carter.
In 1997, I got a letter from Carter that said Anthony didn't do it. And so we had a claim of actual innocence. I argued the case before the court, but they just denied it. So now on the execution table, we have a dying declaration, which we had submitted to the Court of Criminal Appeals, and they still denied us relief on that.
This man just saying this on the gurney isn't enough. And if the state is saying that they gave me a fair trial, regardless of what Mr. Carter said, I'm gonna be executed.
After Carter's letters failed to get Anthony off death row, Greenwood made a play to get Carter on the record just 13 days before his execution.
I got a deposition of Mr. Carter ordered by the federal courts.
Anthony Graves did not have any part in the murder. He was not present before, during, or after I committed these multiple murders that the Davis known.
He then took about 10 minutes to explain without the least bit of remorse or any emotion how he started and went through a house and killed 6 women and children with various weapons and then burned the house down around them. And when he stopped, there was not a sound. We were just in shock.
Carter said he did it all by himself. And sounds good, but you gotta look at the facts. It's totally contrary to the evidence and everything that we had.
During his deposition, Carter gave key testimony explaining that he had told Charles Sebesta that Anthony Graves was innocent the night before Anthony's trial.
Sebesta basically denied it. But then, lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, we found out Sebesta told other people.
At the time of Robert Carter's execution, Geraldo Rivera was in Texas filming a special about death row and Anthony Graves' case.
My co-counsel called me and said, I just got a call from one of Geraldo Rivera's producers, and they've been filming Sebesta, and he admitted on air that, in fact, Carter had told him during the trial that Anthony didn't do it.
And yes, at that point, he did tell us that, oh, I did it myself. I did it. He did tell us that.
Under the law, the prosecutor has to tell the defense counsel of what's called exculpatory evidence, evidence that tends to show innocence. If your key witness, your only witness, says before he testifies, oh, Anthony Graves had nothing to do with it, you have to tell that to defense counsel. If you don't, then that's what's called a Brady violation, and that means that the trial was fundamentally unfair.
Greenwood argued this new information in front of 2 courts, but failed both times. His final argument came in 2006 before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals.
The Fifth Circuit is one of the most conservative courts in our nation. The Fifth Circuit is the kind of court that Jesus had to come down and testify for you, and they're still gonna rule against you.
If Anthony did not win at the Fifth Circuit, he would be on a fast track to execution. So this was our last hope. This was our last stop. Greenwood puts Charles Sebesta on the stand, and he needs to find out, did Mr. Sebesta tell the defense lawyers?
I personally told Graves' attorney the morning before he testified in just kind of an off-the-cuff statement. I said to him, you're not gonna believe this. Now he's saying he did it all by himself. And his response was, what's this, his 8th or 9th or 10th story?
What he says he told us, he never told us. So the jury didn't hear the fact that Carter recanted just before he testified, and because we hadn't heard that.
The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals would take 3 months to issue their ruling.
So one night, March the 3rd, 2006, I'm laying in my bunk, and this officer walks by my cell, and she throws a note into it. And she said, that's a note from another inmate. I think it's something about your case. And I started reading, and it was like, congratulations, man. I just heard on the radio that the Fifth Circuit overturned your conviction. And I just closed my eyes and I started crying, you know. It's about time. But to get a 3-0 unanimous vote in my favor said there were big problems with my case. And they basically told the state of Texas, retry the case or set him free within 180 days, giving the state of Texas a chance to do the right thing.
I thought the state would be forced to release him because there is no evidence against him to retry him. But that's not what the state of Texas decided. The state of Texas decided that it indeed was going to pursue a new trial against Anthony.
The Fifth Circuit did not say he was not guilty. The Fifth Circuit said, we find an error, you retry him. It was not about innocence. It was not about innocence.
By 2006, Anthony Graves had already served 12 years on death row for the murder of the Davis family and was now awaiting his retrial.
I was a young father, 3 sons who I loved dearly. I wasn't able to raise them because they were young when this happened to me. I had to watch them grow up behind bars. I never got a chance to see them play baseball, see them go to the prom. I never got a chance to experience any of that. Now they're grown with their own kids. And I'm still here, awaiting trial again.
When you have lost your children, your mother, your sister, your niece, and your nephew, and you gotta go through this stuff over and over and over again, you can't function like a normal person anymore. You're still stuck in that same year that murders had occurred. We were past exhaustion. Everybody assured us that this time we were going to cover all our bases. We weren't going to make any mistakes, and so it would be a guilty verdict.
Anthony asked me to be part of his legal team. He said, "No one knows as much about my case as you do."
And lo and behold, the judge that's now on my case is the daughter of the retired judge that sentenced me to death.
Robert Carter had been executed. Without Robert Carter, what evidence does the state have? The new trial judge decides that Carter's original trial testimony is admissible in the new trial, even though it's impossible for Anthony's defense counsel to cross-examine a dead man. It seemed that the unfairness of the first trial was now being transplanted in total to the next trial.
The state offered Anthony a possible way out. Pass a polygraph and they'd drop the charges.
I'll take a polygraph. I'll take whatever you want. I have nothing to hide. The polygraph operator sits me in the chair. This is like 8:30 in the morning. Then he leaves, and he's gone an hour. Then he comes back after an hour, asks me how you doing, say one word, 2 words, he leaves for another hour. He did this from all day long up to about 3 o'clock that afternoon. Now he comes in and says, okay, we're gonna take the test. I'm anxious now. I've sat in this chair 6-8 hours. You fed me in this chair, I've fallen asleep in this chair, and you just keep going in and out, in and out, in and out. This is a test that could unite me with my family. I'm paying extra close attention. I wanna make sure I get everything right. And then you say I failed. Blew my mind. Here we go again. Oh, here we go again.
That was pretty devastating because I felt as though maybe I should have advised him not to have done it. You know, if you fail a polygraph, you must be guilty.
Anthony Graves had 2 opportunities to take polygraphs. The first one after he was arrested in 1992, and the second in 2008. He had 2 bites at the apple, and he failed them both. You can draw your own conclusions from that.
In 2010, a special prosecutor was appointed to retry Anthony's case.
Kelly Siegler is a famous Harris County prosecutor who had put 19 men on death row. I still feel confident in our case, but I have to say, having Kelly Siegler as an opponent, that'll make you nervous.
When they brought Kelly Siegler in, we figured, oh, now that Kelly's on it, it'll get done and it'll be over quick.
Well, you know Kelly's gonna come in, she's gonna try to throw any and everything on the wall and see if something sticks.
He knew the guys that she had put on death row, so he knew how good she was.
I've seen a lot of murders, and I've handled a lot of murders, but I have never heard of, nor handled, nor seen a case where 6 people were murdered and 4 of them were little babies innocently asleep in their beds. I was fully expecting that Anthony Graves would be convicted again and put back on death row.
In 2010, Special Prosecutor Kelly Siegler was busy preparing her case for Anthony Graves' second death penalty trial.
I gathered up all 19 of the boxes that at that time existed on Anthony's case, and I read every word in those boxes. And as I read the evidence, the trial transcripts, and sat down with the witnesses, I realized there was a lot more to this story than I ever imagined.
Kelly Siegler called me and she said, I'd like to meet with you and your family. There's something I need to discuss with y'all. She started pointing out these things that Charles Sylvester had done and how he had manipulated the case.
As a prosecutor who's examined so many knife murders and knife ag assaults, I can say the knife presented to the jury by Sylvester was a wobbly, flimsy excuse for a knife.
She said there was no way that a person could use that knife with those type of stab wounds without his hand slipping down on the blade and cutting himself.
Sylvester believed very, very strongly that there had to be 2 or 3 killers. Why couldn't one man all by himself kill sleeping babies and a sleeping teenage girl after taking care of Bobby Davis? I don't understand. And the single worst thing Charles Sebesta did in that trial would be what he did to Yolanda Mathis.
She is a suspect in these murders, and it is quite possible at some point in the future she might be indicted.
In final argument, Sebesta stood up in front of that same jury and said to them, "The defense wants you to believe that Anthony was with his girlfriend that night. Where's Yolanda Mathis?" After he was the one that caused her to not be able to testify in that trial.
I just didn't do it because I was scared.
That day in my house, there were people yelling and cursing and calling Kelly a coward. But it started to make sense to me. The more I think back, I can see how this thing was being set up by Sebesta. Man, he strung us along like you wouldn't believe. And I thought Anthony is not guilty.
I was in my car, my cell phone rang, and it was my co-counsel, and he said, "Nicole, what are you doing?" And I said, "I'm driving." And he said, "Well, pull over."
The lieutenant of the jail came to my cell and flipped the flap open because I was in solitary. And he said, "Hey, Grace, come on, get ready to come go with me."
I talked to Jimmy, and I know that something big has happened because I can tell his voice is, he's kind of breaking. He's emotional, and he said, "I got a call from Kelly Siegler. It's really important."
He opened the door, and it's Nicole. And I see that she's really batting back tears. She's trying not to cry. So I'm thinking in my mind, it's just some more bad news, And she says, "Miss Siegler dropped all the charges against you because you're an innocent man. She's giving you your life back."
It was quite something. It was wonderful.
I dreamed this dream so many nights, and I still woke up behind bars. So we walking down the hall, and it's starting to dawn on me. It's over with, man. This is over with. And in 10 minutes, I was walking out of the side door of the jail with everything that a 45-year-old man owned in his life in a little box. And it was the first time that I was able to tell my mother that I'm coming home.
Someone called me on the phone, and I said, "Who is this?" He said, "Mom, this is your son. This is Anthony." I said, "Oh, yeah, quit playing with me, boy." I was so happy to see him. I think we hugged and we cried for about 10 minutes. This is a dream come true.
Graves' family welcomed him home tonight.
It's a prosecutor's responsibility to make sure that they never fabricate evidence or manipulate witnesses. It was important that people understand that Anthony Graves was wrongfully convicted. And it wasn't a jury's fault, and it wasn't a judge's fault. It was Charles Sebesta's fault and responsibility that this travesty happened. How can you manipulate evidence and manufacture?
After Anthony was exonerated, he filed a grievance against Charles Sebesta with the State Bar of Texas.
I wanted the American people to see this is what justice is supposed to look like. Nobody was too big for it, not even the prosecutor.
The Texas Bar found that Sebesta violated disciplinary rules of professional conduct by mishandling evidence and witness testimony and failing to disclose Robert Carter's recantation. Sebesta was disbarred on June 11, 2015.
There's never been a perfect trial. Even when you win, there are mistakes. And I tried to do what I thought was right.
Every night I go to sleep with the anticipation of something happening to my family. I told Anthony I'd trade his life for mine in a split second because he got out. The prison that we were put in, we're still in it. We can't get out of it.
I'm just as convinced today as I was in 1994 that Anthony Graves did what he was accused of doing.
How can you convict a man that you don't have no evidence on, you know? How can you do that? Because you Charles Sylvester. Charles Sylvester does what he want to do.
It took me 18 and a half years, 6,640 days, along with 2 execution dates to get back home. I have dedicated my life to reforming our criminal justice system so that this does not happen to my grandkids.
Charles Sylvester, what you meant for bad, you actually turned it out to be good for my son. But I still think you should go to hell.
The whole presumption of innocence until guilt is hogwash. You gotta prove you innocent. You better prove it or you're gonna go to prison.